Good evening, this is the Wavecast Radio. A new virus emerged quietly in central China, moving unseen through hospitals and communities. Early symptoms were subtle: pressure behind the eyes, mild nausea, fatigue easily dismissed. Doctors recorded cases as routine illness, unaware that something far more deadly had arrived. Within hours, hospitals began to fail under unexplained rapid deaths. Patients arrived alert and coherent, only to collapse in terror. Tremors ran through limbs. Speech faltered. Coordination failed. Breathing became shallow and irregular. Within 4 hours, organs shut down. No treatment slowed the progression. The virus, now named QX17, is highly contagious. It spreads through the air, through contact, and from bodily fluids. Isolation is no guarantee. Entire wards became vectors as caregivers fell beside the patients they tried to save. Exposure almost always led to rapid deterioration. Quarantine measures were implemented locally, but containment failed. Homes became isolation cells, streets emptied under panic, and the wealthy fled to fortified compounds and private facilities. Meanwhile, QX17 spread outward from China, traveling silently through airports, transport networks, and densely populated areas. Nations were soon confronting outbreaks before understanding what had arrived. Symptoms progressed with horrifying consistency. Nausea and dizziness evolved into tremors, accelerated heartbeat, and shallow respiration. Speech and movement deteriorated. By the 4th hour, death was inevitable. Rare survivors carried permanent organ strain, weakness, and psychological trauma. Memories of being measured, observed, and nearly consumed. Even as governments imposed travel restrictions, hospitals reported overcapacity. Emergency responders collapsed mid-shift. Communities began to understand the scale of the threat only after fatalities rose exponentially. QX17 respected no borders. It did not need chaos to spread. It only required time, proximity, and patience. The world was now facing a virus that had begun in China but was unstoppable globally. Every moment, every interaction carried the potential for death. Humanity was confronting a pathogen faster than medicine, faster than policy, and faster than preparation. This is the emergence of QX17. The virus has begun its global journey, and the worst is yet to come. The world barely had time to mourn the first deaths before QX17 extended its reach beyond China, moving silently yet with devastating inevitability. The virus did not announce itself through chaos. It spread through the quiet of normal life. Airplanes crisscrossed continents, trains and buses ferried unaware passengers, and the pathogen infiltrated cities before authorities could fully comprehend the speed of its advance. Globalization, once humanity's strength, became its unwitting vector. Neighborhoods, business districts, and residential blocks were infected in waves too rapid for containment. Hospitals, already buckling under initial cases, collapsed under exponential demand. Corridors, once orderly and sterile, filled with patients who arrived lucid one moment and perished the next. Intensive care units overflowed within hours, and ventilators, oxygen, and life support equipment vanished almost immediately. Supply lines could not keep pace with need. Entire hospital wings were abandoned as staff succumbed to infection or fled, leaving survivors to witness colleagues, friends, and neighbors vanish before their eyes. Even the most experienced doctors found themselves powerless, forced to prioritize by survival probability rather than need. The strain on medical personnel was unrelenting. Exhaustion became physical and mental collapse. Doctors and nurses worked in shifts that blurred days and nights, often without sleep, nutrition, or support. Protective measures slowed exposure temporarily. But no barrier was absolute. Mortality among caregivers surged, further eroding confidence and leaving patients exposed. Ethical dilemmas multiplied. When resources could not save all, decisions became life or death lotteries, and every choice carried unbearable weight. Meanwhile, cities struggled to maintain order. Public transportation halted. Emergency response teams were paralyzed, and morgues overflowed with bodies that could not be processed fast enough. Urban centers, once teeming with human activity, transformed into silent zones of fear. Streets emptied as people barricaded themselves indoors, not out of hope for protection, but out of the recognition that exposure anywhere could be fatal. Even sunlight offered no safety. The virus thrived in unseen vectors, invisible and indifferent. Supply chains fractured. Pharmacies reliant on global distribution ran dry in hours. Medicines that might delay symptoms became unattainable. Hospitals became war zones of scarcity, and makeshift triage centers emerged in auditoriums, stadiums, and empty warehouses. In these temporary facilities, medical staff improvised, knowing that every treatment was only a temporary measure against a virus that required patience rather than speed. Fear, exhaustion, and grief permeated every corner of society. Survivors moved cautiously, whispering of colleagues who had vanished, of family members claimed in hours, of entire neighborhoods emptied overnight. The virus had rendered distance meaningless, travel unsafe, and preparation almost irrelevant. QX17 did not need spectacle or force. It merely advanced with cold, patient precision. By the time humanity realized the scope of its spread, it had already infiltrated the systems designed to resist it. Hospitals were no longer refuges. Cities were no longer sanctuaries. The virus required no haste, no announcement, no applause. Its presence was a quiet certainty. Death was everywhere, inevitable and absolute. Symptoms of QX17 manifested with terrifying speed and consistency. Patients could awaken, seemingly healthy, only to collapse hours later into unconsciousness. Tremors racked the body. Hearts raced erratically. Breathing became shallow, labored, as if each inhale were a battle. A pervasive sense of dread accompanied every episode, pressing against consciousness, eroding hope even before organ systems failed. Survivors of early exposure were anomalies, lucky, resilient, or somehow partially spared, but each carried permanent damage. Hearts and lungs remained fragile. Kidneys faltered. Neurological function was subtly impaired. Psychological scars, panic, hypervigilance, insomnia etched themselves permanently into memory. Communities scrambled to respond, but every effort was undermined by the virus's patient inevitability. Quarantine orders were imposed, streets cleared, and schools and offices shuttered. Yet the contagion moved silently through gaps, overlooked interactions, and asymptomatic carriers. Fear spread faster than mandates, emptying cities more effectively than government decree. Even isolated estates and fortified compounds could not offer absolute safety. A single lapse, a delivery, a worker, a momentary contact was sufficient for infiltration. Within hospitals and emergency centers, chaos became routine. Personnel faced impossible triage decisions. When every patient required immediate attention, who received care? Beds and ventilators were rationed according to proximity, survival probability, or mere circumstance. Supply shortages magnified the cruelty. Oxygen cylinders ran dry, medications were exhausted, monitoring equipment failed. Entire wings were cordoned off, abandoned not for recovery, but to contain infection. Death became both statistical and anonymous, stripping humanity from every passing moment. The strain on caregivers was catastrophic. Exhaustion, grief, and fear accumulated daily, eroding judgment. Some succumbed to illness, others to despair, leaving remaining staff stretched beyond capacity. Makeshift treatment areas emerged in gyms, auditoriums, and warehouses, but these spaces lacked even basic equipment. Improvisation became the standard, survival the only objective, and compassion a fleeting luxury. Communities outside hospitals fared no better. Public services halted. Transportation networks froze. Essential supply chains fractured. Communication became fragmented and unreliable, leaving individuals to navigate isolation, scarcity, and risk, largely alone. Panic became ambient, a background hum of whispered fears, abrupt movements, and constant uncertainty. The world had transformed into a space where preparation and caution mattered, but could never guarantee survival. 𝙤𝙤𝙪'𝙧𝙚 required no aggression, no chaos. It only required patience. It moved through societies with relentless inevitability, exploiting gaps in vigilance, infrastructure, and human endurance. Death was no longer an event. It was the environment. Every breath, every interaction, every lapse carried the weight of mortality. Humanity's defenses, both physical and psychological, were overwhelmed. And still the virus waited, silent, precise, unstoppable. Global awareness arrived only after devastation had spread beyond control. Nations reported cases when mortality had already surged into the tens of thousands. Data lagged behind reality. Statistical bulletins could not capture the human cost. The empty streets, shuttered markets, and families lost before help could arrive. By the time governments acted, 𝙤𝙤𝙪'𝙧𝙚 had embedded itself deeply into populations, exploiting the very structures meant to sustain life. Every interaction carried risk. Travel, once routine, became a calculation of life and death. Workforces vanished as offices and factories closed or were abandoned. Even simple tasks, shopping, delivering supplies, checking on neighbors, required assessment of exposure and probability. Societies that had depended on interconnection, reliance, and cooperation found these traits now amplified vulnerability. The virus capitalized on proximity, patience, and human predictability. Fear became the primary driver of behavior. Families barricaded themselves indoors, rationing food and water to minimize outings. Entire neighborhoods fell silent, windows shuttered, doors locked, as residents withdrew into isolated survival. Mental strain intensified, anxiety, paranoia, and depression compounded, producing behaviors previously unseen: overzealous sanitation, obsessive monitoring of symptoms, and extreme distrust of outsiders. Communities fractured even where population density was low. Cohesion became impossible under relentless threat. The wealthy sought escape where possible. Private compounds, fortified estates, and specialized medical services offered temporary refuge, delaying exposure through extreme measures. But safety was provisional. Even these barriers could be breached by lapses, infected staff, or supply vulnerabilities. For the majority, survival depended on avoidance, adaptation, and the constant assessment of risk. Streets and public spaces were abandoned, transforming cities into ghostly corridors where silence was the only defense. Supplies became battlegrounds. Panic buying emptied markets. Warehouses that remained staffed were under siege from demand and fear. Distribution networks failed as transport systems ground to a halt. Workers fell ill and logistics collapsed. Essentials, food, medicine, fuel were scarce. Improvisation became a necessity. Home gardens, rainwater collection, and local bartering replaced conventional commerce. The human struggle became less about thriving and more about clinging to life for the next hour, day, and week. QX17 did not need to accelerate its spread. Patience amplified its lethality. By moving silently through populations, exploiting human interdependence and emotional fragility, the virus transformed society itself. Structures that had been the backbone of civilization, hospitals, schools, markets, offices, transportation, were rendered impotent. Humanity was left to navigate an existence defined by absence, caution, and relentless psychological pressure. Even in isolation, survival was not guaranteed. The virus had made fear a permanent condition, and it waited, indifferent, inevitable, and omnipresent. And yet QX17 moved forward with patient, unyielding precision. It required no spectacle, no frenzy, no overt destruction to dominate. It simply existed in the spaces humans occupied, exploiting routine, proximity, and trust. Every breath taken near another person became a potential conduit. Every handshake, shared object, or casual conversation carried silent risk. Humanity's most mundane interactions transformed into threats that could not be mitigated, only delayed. From its origin in China, the virus radiated outward, unseen and unstoppable. International travel, global commerce, and interconnected infrastructure served as unwitting accelerants. By the time the first deaths appeared in distant hospitals, tens of thousands were already infected, incubating disease in hidden pockets of cities. Major urban centers, from New York and London to Sao Paulo and Mumbai, struggled to recognize patterns, often documenting cases only after mass fatalities had occurred. Even rural regions previously considered insulated could not escape entirely. Infection traveled along every human vector available. The virus exploited human systems with cruel efficiency. Hospitals overflowed, morgues filled, and medical personnel already overwhelmed became vectors themselves. The wealthy temporarily delayed exposure, accessing private clinics and advanced treatments, but the patient virus required nothing more than time to infiltrate even the most protected bastions. Supplies ran dry, quarantine measures proved incomplete, and social structures fractured under persistent strain. Globally, fear became both shield and cage. Streets emptied, schools, offices, and factories shut down. Families isolated, sometimes permanently, leaving children and elders under constant anxiety. Mental health deteriorated rapidly. Panic, paranoia, depression, and insomnia became widespread, undermining resilience even where infection had not yet occurred. Humanity learned to calculate every movement, every contact. Yet these measures could only slow what was inevitable. The fundamental truth crystallized. Within 4 hours of exposure, survival was no longer assured. Time itself became a vector, as the virus waited patiently for vulnerability to appear. It did not rush, but it did not stop. Its lethality was mechanical, precise, and inexorable. QX17 had outpaced preparation, policy, and comprehension. The living discovered too late that their most fundamental assumptions, proximity, social order, and trust, were now liabilities. Survival demanded vigilance beyond capacity, fear beyond endurance, and resilience beyond precedent. The virus was patient, and humanity had nowhere to hide. The virus's relentless spread exposed the fragility of every medical system. Hospitals were no longer sanctuaries. They became cages of despair. Emergency rooms overflowed with victims, some barely conscious, others already succumbing to the virus's fatal command. Hallways became corridors of unending suffering. Every available bed was claimed, Yet new arrivals appeared faster than staff could respond. Doctors and nurses moved from one patient to another, eyes wide with exhaustion, fingers trembling, hearts breaking. Protective gear offered little reassurance. QX-17 infiltrated hospitals with surgical precision. Entire floors were evacuated as medical staff fell ill themselves. Mortality outpaced documentation. Death became a blur, anonymous yet total, as hospitals struggled to maintain order amidst chaos. Outside, communities were paralyzed by fear. Streets emptied. People barricaded themselves in homes. Public transport stopped. Offices and factories shuttered, and essential services faltered. Quarantine zones existed in name only, often breached inadvertently by deliveries or human error. The virus thrived on these gaps, spreading silently and efficiently. Symptoms remained terrifyingly predictable, yet horrifying in execution. Early nausea and dizziness escalated into violent tremors, labored breathing, and an overwhelming sense of doom. Speech faltered, limbs failed, coordination vanished. By the fourth hour, life ended for most. Those who survived faced weeks of organ strain, chronic fatigue, and mental trauma. The world was learning the impossible speed with which QX-17 could erase life. Supply chains collapsed as factories closed, workplaces halted, and transportation networks failed. Supermarkets emptied faster than they could restock. Medication ran low. Clean water and sanitation became scarce. Humanity's infrastructure crumbled under the relentless pressure of a virus that exploited every vulnerability. Even private compounds and fortified estates were not immune. Wealth could delay exposure, but it could not prevent it entirely. The virus patiently waited, striking when opportunity arose, bypassing precautions with invisible precision. Those who thought themselves safe were merely delayed victims. Information networks struggled to keep pace with reality. News of mass fatalities spread unevenly, causing panic where awareness lagged and false hope, where overconfidence persisted. Social cohesion fractured, leaving isolated communities vulnerable to both infection and despair. Fear was no longer a reaction. It had become a constant companion, an unyielding force shaping every action. The global population was learning a brutal truth. Containment had failed. Every hospital overflow, every collapsed system, every unheeded precaution was a stepping stone for QX-17. Humanity was no longer merely exposed. It was being measured, cataloged, and eradicated with patient efficiency. And still, the virus waited. It required no haste. It needed no chaos. It thrived on inevitability. The virus had already reached every corner of human civilization. Borders closed, flights canceled, and ships anchored at deserted ports. Yet QX-17 had already crossed continents. Communities were left to confront an invisible predator on their own. Quarantine became the default state of existence. Streets remained empty for days that stretched into weeks. Homes were transformed into isolation chambers, where fear and silence became as oppressive as the virus itself. Families were forced to separate. Parents hid from children. Siblings avoided one another. Even in the wealthiest compounds, isolation was incomplete. Invisible carriers could bypass barriers with effortless precision. The majority of the population faced a stark reality. Survival depended on solitude, vigilance, and luck. Every interaction, no matter how brief, carried the potential for fatal exposure. Hospitals became overcrowded, holding zones rather than centers of care. Overflow patients were confined to hallways, gyms, and temporary shelters. Those who arrived in time often died before any treatment could begin. Doctors and nurses operated under the weight of impossible moral decisions, choosing who could receive care when resources were gone. Protective protocols failed as 𝙤𝙤𝙬𝙤 infiltrated every layer of defense. The virus's efficiency made containment efforts futile. Quarantine did not slow 𝙤𝙤𝙬𝙤. It amplified fear. Communities became fragmented. Supply chains were disrupted. Factories shut down. Workplaces ceased operation. Commerce halted. Essential services struggled to function with dwindling personnel. Electric grids faltered in places where operators fell ill. The modern conveniences once taken for granted were suddenly irrelevant, leaving humanity exposed in more ways than one. Psychological strain compounded the physical danger. Individuals isolated in apartments or homes reported insomnia, hallucinations, and heightened anxiety. The absence of human contact became its own form of torment. Communication was limited to brief radio transmissions, handwritten notes, or distant visual signals. Paranoia spread alongside the virus, and mistrust became a survival mechanism. The wealthy attempted to shield themselves. Private medical facilities and fortified estates provided temporary refuge. Yet even these sanctuaries could not fully eliminate risk. Visitors, deliveries, and human error introduced the possibility of infection. Meanwhile, the majority were left vulnerable to mass exposure and rapid fatality. Inequality became a matter of life and death. Globally, governments imposed strict curfews, enforced isolation, and restricted movement. But the virus continued to spread silently. 𝙤𝙤𝙬𝙤 did not act with haste. It waited patiently, striking when human routines offered the greatest opportunity. Isolation delayed exposure for some, but it could not prevent it indefinitely. The world had entered a state of suspended life. Cities became ghost towns. Public spaces remained barren. Humanity was forced to adapt instantly or perish. Survival no longer depended on skill, strength, or intelligence alone. It depended on timing, proximity, and a measure of fortune no one could control. And still, 𝙤𝙤𝙬𝙤 remained patient. It had already infiltrated every continent, every city, every community. The virus was global. It was inevitable. Humanity had discovered too late that survival was unequally distributed. 𝙤𝙤𝙬𝙤 did not discriminate, but wealth offered temporary protection. The rich fled to fortified compounds and secluded facilities, where advanced medical care, constant monitoring, and controlled environments delayed exposure. Special Medicare, exclusive treatments, rapid intervention, and constant surveillance provided a fragile shield against the virus. Inside these sanctuaries, life continued in a semblance of order, but it was a fragile illusion. Outside, chaos reigned. The majority of people faced 𝙤𝙤𝙬𝙤 unprotected. The streets were empty, factories closed, workplaces fell silent, grocery stores and service hubs became perilous zones where even brief contact could prove fatal. Transportation systems ground to a halt, leaving millions stranded. Supply chains collapsed. Modern civilization, built on interdependence, revealed its fragility in the face of a virus that needed only opportunity. Hospitals overflowed everywhere. Emergency responders were exhausted, often succumbing to the virus themselves. Ventilators, oxygen, and essential equipment were unavailable for most. In some facilities, corpses lay in corridors for days before collection. Death moved efficiently, relentlessly, and impartially. 𝙤𝙤𝙬𝙤's spread was patient, calculated, and devastatingly precise. Outside protective compounds, fear mutated into despair. Survivors reported unrelenting anxiety, insomnia, and depression. Families were separated, sometimes permanently, as quarantine, exposure, and panic forced isolation. Social bonds became liabilities and community trust frayed. Even for the wealthy, survival was not guaranteed. 𝙤𝙤𝙪'𝙧𝙚 could exploit the smallest lapse. A delivery, a visitor, a single misstep. Special Medicare delayed death, treated symptoms rapidly, and reduced immediate risk. But it could not fully eradicate exposure. The privileged lived in constant vigilance, knowing that safety was temporary. Meanwhile, the majority endured the full force of the virus, exposed to a lethal inevitability. Global economies faltered. Factories and businesses ceased operation. Electric grids struggled where operators were incapacitated. Transportation networks stalled. Online systems collapsed as workers, IT staff, and essential personnel succumbed. Humanity's reliance on complex infrastructure became a vulnerability, exploited by a virus that required only time and proximity. The divide was stark and existential. Some observed the world from secure isolation protected by advanced Medicare and privilege. Others vanished in hours. Their lives ended before intervention could arrive. Fear became constant, and every movement outside, even for basic necessities, was a calculated risk. 𝙤𝙤𝙪'𝙧𝙚 had transformed existence into two realities, one of temporary sanctuary, one of relentless exposure, and in both, death lingered silently, patiently, and unyielding. Healthcare systems did not collapse suddenly. They hollowed out from within. Administrative frameworks disintegrated first, followed by logistics, then manpower. Treatment protocols became irrelevant as resources vanished. Entire departments shut down not by decision, but by attrition. When the last trained staff left or fell ill, facilities ceased to function regardless of how intact the buildings remained. Medical professionals endured a level of moral injury that left lasting scars. Each decision carried consequence and guilt. Choosing one patient meant abandoning another. Pain relief replaced treatment as the final offering. Charts went unfinished. Diagnoses were made verbally, sometimes silently, because documentation no longer mattered. The concept of recovery faded, replaced by containment and comfort when possible. Outside hospital walls, the consequences multiplied. Ambulances stopped responding. Emergency calls went unanswered. People transported the sick themselves, only to find locked entrances or darkened wards. Many turned back, realizing too late that there was nowhere left to go. Homes became makeshift infirmaries. Families attempted care with dwindling supplies, watching loved ones deteriorate without guidance or relief. Medical knowledge fragmented. With training institutions closed and communication disrupted, experience became localized and inconsistent. Improvised treatment circulated through rumor rather than evidence. Some helped briefly, others hastened decline. Trust in medicine eroded not from ignorance, but from relentless exposure to loss. Survival began to feel arbitrary, detached from expertise or preparation. Those who continued working did so beyond physical and emotional limits. Sleep deprivation impaired judgment. Trauma accumulated without reprieve. Some staff remained on duty until collapse. Others walked away entirely, unable to reconcile duty with futility. The line between caregiver and patient blurred as exhaustion and exposure claimed even the most resilient. The healthcare system had not merely failed, it had transformed. What once existed to restore life now bore witness to its withdrawal. 𝙤𝙤𝙪'𝙧𝙚 did not destroy hospitals through force. It rendered them obsolete through saturation. And as these institutions fell silent, humanity lost one of its final assurances that illness could be met with help. In the wake of that realization, fear deepened. There was no higher level of care left to reach. The death toll surpassed comprehension. Numbers lost meaning as loss became visual rather than statistical. Entire districts fell quiet, not through evacuation, but absence. Lights stayed off. Vehicles rusted in place. Public spaces decayed untouched. Their purpose erased. The world did not end in violence. It faded through attrition. Emergency services ceased functioning as systems. Crews were unavailable, equipment unusable, communication fractured. Bodies remained where life had ended, wrapped hastily or left untouched out of fear. Rituals surrounding death dissolved, replaced by avoidance. Grief was postponed indefinitely, buried beneath survival priorities. Containment measures persisted in name only. Barriers, checkpoints, and advisories offered psychological comfort, but little protection. QX-17 required minimal opportunity. A shared surface, a delayed reaction, a moment of fatigue, each was sufficient. The virus did not rush. It observed patterns, exploited weakness, and advanced without urgency. Communities unraveled gradually. Cooperation eroded into isolation. Mutual aid collapsed under suspicion. Doors remained closed long after those inside were gone. Children disappeared from windows. Voices vanished from balconies. Absence replaced presence as the dominant feature of human settlements. Families fractured beyond repair. Separation, intended as protection, became a permanent absence. Final words were often never exchanged. Closure became impossible, replaced by uncertainty that lingered longer than grief. Those left behind carried not only loss, but unanswered questions that deepened psychological injury. Society's infrastructure tore apart not from force, but from prolonged strain. Supply routes dissolved. Governance lost relevance. Authority meant little when survival became individual and immediate. The virus revealed how thin the threads of civilization truly were when continuity was broken. QX-17 did not announce victory. It did not need to. The world simply grew quieter. The shortage of medicine accelerated the unraveling. Production lines that once delivered precision treatments fell silent as workers vanished and raw materials stopped arriving. Distribution networks fractured, leaving storage facilities full in some regions and barren in others. Even tightly controlled reserves meant for emergencies were exhausted within weeks. Advanced interventions became theoretical luxuries, referenced in protocols that could no longer be enacted. For the privileged, protection eroded slowly but unmistakably. Private clinics rationed care behind reinforced walls, extending life in controlled environments while knowing the outcome remained unchanged. Treatments bought intervals, time measured in hours rather than recovery. As supplies diminished, even these insulated systems began to mirror the conditions outside. The virus did not discriminate, it only waited. Global information channels continued to transmit fragments of reality. Updates arrived incomplete, delayed, or contradictory. One report described entire healthcare regions devoid of staff. Another confirmed mass fatalities in urban centers previously considered stable. Governments issued reassurances without substance, their authority weakened by the visible absence of solutions. Coordination faltered as each region prioritized survival over cooperation. Infrastructure followed medicine into decline. Factories shut down not by decree, but through attrition. Skilled operators were no longer available to maintain production. Power grids failed in segments as technicians fell ill or abandoned posts. Rolling outages became permanent darkness in some areas. Transportation networks stalled. Rail systems frozen. Ports inactive. Highways empty except for abandoned vehicles. Economic systems lost relevance. Markets ceased operation. Employment dissolved. Digital commerce collapsed alongside physical supply chains. What value once existed in currency evaporated, replaced by immediate necessity. Survival became localized, dependent on proximity rather than policy. The virus revealed the interdependence humanity had taken for granted. When one system failed, others followed. Medicine could not function without logistics. Infrastructure could not endure without labor. Governance could not operate without trust. 𝙤𝙤𝙪'𝙧𝙚 exploited this interconnected fragility with precision, requiring no escalation, no adaptation beyond patience. As the world dimmed, lights failing, voices disappearing, systems collapsing, the realization settled universally. Human civilization was not being destroyed. It was being outlasted. Survivors recounted scenes that seemed impossible to reconcile with memory. Entire hospital wings emptied within hours, sometimes leaving only the faint echo of footsteps and the lingering scent of antiseptic. Families disappeared in a single day, leaving homes locked, belongings untouched, and doors swinging on silent hinges. Neighborhoods emptied almost overnight, streets littered with abandoned vehicles, toys, and groceries. The living moved cautiously, measuring every sound, every movement, every interaction, knowing that human contact had become a potential death sentence. Even the sun, once a source of comfort, offered no reassurance. Its warmth did not diminish the virus's reach, and isolation remained the only, albeit imperfect, protection. 𝙤𝙤𝙪'𝙧𝙚 did not rush. There was no frenzy, no urgency in its spread. It advanced with meticulous patience, exploiting human weakness with quiet efficiency. The world wore itself down. Fear, starvation, exhaustion, and despair became the virus's allies. Systems designed to sustain life faltered under the weight of overwhelming need. Hospitals, once centers of hope, were reduced to empty shells. Supply chains collapsed, power grids faltered, communication networks went dark. Humanity's infrastructure, the web of interdependence it had relied upon for centuries, crumbled under relentless pressure. Death ceased to be a distant threat. It became a certainty for most, a looming presence for all. Survivors moved like shadows, calculating each step, rationing each breath, weighing every decision against the possibility of a fatal lapse. Mental strain intensified. Anxiety and paranoia ran rampant. Sleep was a rare refuge, and despair became a constant companion. The virus was not only a biological predator, it was a psychological one, embedding fear and hopelessness into the very fabric of human existence. Even in the rare pockets where life persisted, normalcy was impossible. Social bonds frayed under the relentless stress of isolation and loss. Communities dissolved, replaced by fragmented clusters of survivors, each guarding its own safety at the expense of connection. The world had been reduced to its barest elements: breath, survival, and the ever-present shadow of inevitability. 𝙤𝙤𝙪'𝙧𝙚's patience was absolute. It needed no force, no spectacle, no rapid outbreak to dominate. Humanity's exhaustion, fear, and disarray were sufficient. Civilization had not been destroyed in a moment. It had been eroded day by day until only the quiet certainty of mortality remained. In every empty street, in every silent home, in every whispered fear, the virus's presence was undeniable. Death was no longer an event. It had become the defining condition of existence. Fear hardened into a permanent condition. It shaped behavior, distorted judgment, and rewired instinct. People no longer reacted to danger. They anticipated it constantly. Every breath felt monitored, every sensation examined for signs of decline. A harmless ache triggered panic. A moment of dizziness became a countdown. Minds fractured under the strain of endless vigilance, trapped between survival instinct and exhaustion. Mental health deteriorated rapidly. Anxiety disorders surged beyond anything previously documented. Depression settled heavily over communities, stripping motivation and eroding identity. Some lost the ability to speak for extended periods, their nervous systems overwhelmed by continuous stress. Others developed compulsive behaviors, ritualized cleaning, obsessive monitoring of vitals, repeated isolation far beyond necessity, attempts to impose control where none truly existed. Isolation reshaped human relationships. Physical closeness became forbidden. Comfort was delivered through barriers. Gestures replaced embraces, and grief unfolded in silence. Death announcements arrived without ceremony, often delayed or unconfirmed. Mourning became internal, unshared, unresolved. The absence of closure compounded trauma, leaving emotional wounds open and untreated. Urban environments transformed into spaces of quiet menace. Buildings stood intact, but functionally lifeless. Transportation corridors decayed unused. Hospitals, once centers of hope, became symbols of failure and avoidance. The virus was not visible, yet its influence saturated every environment, an invisible authority dictating movement, thought, and interaction. Children suffered in ways that defied measurement. Development stalled under isolation. Education dissolved into fragments. Many struggled to understand absence. Friends who vanished, relatives who never returned. Play became solitary and subdued. Questions went unanswered because adults no longer had explanations that comforted rather than frightened. The human nervous system was not designed for unending threat. Over time, many reached a breaking point. Some withdrew entirely, disengaging from communication and responsibility. Others clung to denial, rejecting reality as a defense against psychological collapse. Both paths led to further fragmentation of society. 𝙔𝙤𝙪'𝙧𝙚 did not need to infect everybody to dominate humanity. It infiltrated thought, altered behavior, and redefined existence. Long before death arrived, it had already claimed something essential. Peace of mind was gone. Safety was theoretical. And fear has become the world's most reliable constant. Mental illness surged beyond containment. What began as fear matured into dysfunction. Panic attacks struck without warning, hijacking breath and motor control. Anxiety no longer responded to reassurance. It entrenched itself, mutating into fixation. People tracked airflow through rooms, sealed cracks obsessively, and avoided open spaces as though exposure could seep through walls. Ordinary environments became hostile terrain shaped by imagined threats layered atop real danger. Depression followed closely, quieter, but equally destructive. It drained purpose from daily life, hollowed motivation, and erased the desire to endure. Some stopped eating, others remained motionless for hours, detached from surroundings, overwhelmed by the certainty of loss. Medical professionals noted cognitive decline in otherwise healthy individuals. Memory gaps, emotional blunting, impaired reasoning. Symptoms driven not by infection, but by sustained psychological pressure. Sleep disorders became widespread. Insomnia stretched into days, then weeks. When rest came, it offered no relief. Dreams carried vivid sensations of suffocation, disorientation, and collapse. Many awoke unsure whether they were ill or merely afraid. Hallucinations emerged in isolation. Movement where none existed. Voices without source. A sensation of presence that refused explanation. Survivors described a feeling of being observed, not by people, but by something pervasive and deliberate. Even those shielded by wealth found no refuge from mental erosion. Behind secured compounds and controlled environments, the privileged lived under constant calculation. Every interaction was measured, every routine scrutinized. Survival demanded vigilance that never relaxed. Guilt accumulated alongside safety, awareness of protection built on exclusion, of life preserved while countless others vanished beyond reinforced boundaries. Isolation stripped meaning from comfort, leaving emptiness where security was meant to reside. Fear equalized humanity. It crossed barriers wealth had erected and infiltrated every mind without discrimination. Psychological resilience fractured under prolonged exposure to uncertainty, loss, and helplessness. The virus did not need to infect everyone physically. It embedded itself in cognition, reshaping thought patterns, destabilizing perception, and eroding trust in reality itself. QX17 advanced through bodies, but it conquered through the mind. By the time symptoms appeared, many had already been broken. Global societies splintered under sustained psychological strain. What remained after the initial devastation was not unity, but fragility. Decision-making slowed as fear distorted judgment. Communities that had once coordinated food distribution or medical care began to fracture, their cooperation eroded by suspicion. Supplies were hidden rather than shared. Doors stayed closed. Familiar faces became potential threats. Daily structure collapsed. Work schedules dissolved. Education ceased. Social responsibilities were abandoned in favor of personal preservation. Communication channels once essential for coordination transformed into conduits of dread. Each update delivered new numbers, new losses, new reminders of vulnerability. Many chose silence over exposure, withdrawing from information entirely to preserve mental stability. Even in spaces long vacated by the sick and dying, anxiety persisted. Empty hospitals carried the weight of failure. Abandoned neighborhoods radiated unease as though contagion lingered in absence itself. People reacted to the smallest stimuli with disproportionate fear. An echo in a stairwell, a sudden noise, a passing shadow. The environment became a constant test of emotional endurance. Survival took on a new definition. Strength, preparation, and skill offered limited protection against the psychological assault. Endurance meant tolerating uncertainty without collapse, managing fear without letting it dictate every decision. Those unable to do so unraveled quietly, withdrawing from community and responsibility, leaving behind shells of former lives. QX17 no longer required proximity to dominate. It reshaped cognition, eroded trust, and dismantled social cohesion without direct contact. The virus embedded itself within collective consciousness, rewriting how humanity perceives safety, connection, and future. The damage extended beyond biology. Even if QX17 vanished, its imprint would remain, etched into memory, behavior, and the fragile remains of global society. Across continents, laboratories pulsed with activity, yet hope steadily eroded. Research facilities that once symbolized human mastery over disease now felt like containment zones for failure. Screens filled with genomic sequences that refused to stabilize. Every mutation mapped revealed new complications, new dead ends. International cooperation intensified, but coordination could not compensate for the virus's unpredictable evolution. QX17 did not resist treatment through brute force. It slipped past defenses with calculated subtlety. Medical consensus fractured. What slowed deterioration in one patient accelerated organ failure in another. Blood markers shifted without warning. The virus rewrote biological rules faster than protocols could be updated. Autopsies revealed catastrophic internal damage, liquefied lung tissue, neurological degradation, cardiac collapse occurring in carefully timed succession. Death was not chaotic. It followed a precise internal sequence that medicine could observe, but not interrupt. Hospitals transformed into triage corridors. Entire wings were abandoned after staph infection surged. Doctors rationed care not by age or morality, but by probability of survival measured in hours. Ventilators became irrelevant. 𝙤𝙤𝙪 suffocated from within, bypassing mechanical support entirely. Protective equipment delayed exposure but never prevented it. Medical workers vanished from rosters overnight, replaced by volunteers with minimal training and overwhelming fear. Inside research centers, exhaustion bred recklessness. Procedures once unthinkable were authorized under emergency mandates. Gene editing trials, accelerated compound testing, and cross-species simulations were launched simultaneously. Some subjects survived longer, minutes, sometimes an hour, but none escaped the outcome. Each temporary delay was celebrated before the inevitable decline resumed. 𝙤𝙤𝙪'𝙧𝙚 tolerated intervention, adjusted, and proceeded. The psychological toll on scientists proved devastating. Researchers watched their life's work fail in real time while death counts climbed beyond comprehension. Many stopped returning home, sleeping beside lab benches, knowing isolation no longer mattered. Some broke under the pressure, abandoning projects mid-cycle. Others pushed forward mechanically, driven not by optimism, but by refusal to surrender without resistance. Global communication shifted in tone. Scientific briefings no longer promised solutions, only transparency. Governments were informed that eradication was unattainable. Containment had failed. Immunity was impossible. At best, mitigation might delay the inevitable. The virus was not burning through humanity. It was studying it, exploiting biological certainty with unnerving restraint. By the time this truth became unavoidable, millions were already dead, not from panic or collapse, but from a pathogen that required no haste. 𝙤𝙤𝙪'𝙧𝙚 did not overwhelm civilization through speed. It dismantled it through inevitability. And within laboratories filled with exhausted minds and dimming screens, one conclusion settled heavily over the world. Human intelligence had encountered something it could not outthink. Globally, official communication fractured under pressure. Governments issued statements that contradicted one another, revised projections daily, and quietly withdrew earlier assurances. The public absorbed the reality not through announcements, but through absence. Empty hospitals, unanswered emergency lines, and streets stripped of routine. As confidence dissolved, fear filled the vacuum. Workplaces were deserted. Transportation hubs fell silent. Entire districts locked themselves away, not by mandate, but by instinct. The realization cut deep. Intellect alone was no longer enough. Scientific authority, once a stabilizing force, now carried the weight of visible defeat. People began questioning every directive, every recommendation, every delay. Panic was no longer explosive. It became sustained, internalized, shaping decisions with quiet desperation. Families separated voluntarily, believing distance might delay infection. Others clustered tightly, choosing comfort over probability. Wealth created temporary insulation. Private compounds, isolated medical facilities, and restricted access research teams emerged for those who could afford them. Experimental regimens were administered behind closed doors. Custom antivirals, immune suppressors, tailored protocols unavailable to the public. These interventions did not save lives, but they stretched time. Symptoms advanced more slowly. Decline arrived later. For the privileged, death was postponed, not prevented. The virus tolerated the interference and continued its course. Beyond those protected zones, reality was brutal and immediate. Pharmacies ran dry. Hospitals stopped admitting patients entirely once staffing collapsed. Medical wards became places people avoided. Knowing entry often meant never leaving. Bodies accumulated faster than burial systems could manage. In some regions, documentation ceased altogether. Death counts became estimates, then assumptions. Survivors exhibited signs of profound psychological damage. Anxiety manifested as physical illness. Sleep became fragmented or vanished. Hallucinations, paranoia, and emotional numbness spread through populations already weakened by grief. Children withdrew. Adults lost basic decision-making capacity under prolonged stress. The virus did not only dismantle organs, it dismantled identity, routine, and hope. Field data painted a picture too vast to ignore. Cities hollowed out in days. Infrastructure failed not from attack, but from abandonment. QX17 exploited every weakness in human systems. Reliance on speed, density, and constant interaction. It exposed how quickly order unraveled when continuity was broken. This was no longer an outbreak. It was a restructuring of existence under biological dominance. QX17 had surpassed the limits of response. It did not need escalation. It required no mutation dramatic enough to announce itself. It advanced steadily, indifferent to borders, wealth, or resistance. Humanity was not being overrun. It was being outlasted. And as the world absorbed this truth, one understanding settled universally, without translation or debate. The virus did not need to win quickly. It only needed time. Across continents, laboratories, and emergency research hubs, a singular truth solidified with crushing clarity. Humanity possessed no cure. Every compound tested, every genetic pathway explored, every last theoretical safeguard failed to neutralize QX17. Interventions bought fragments of time, hours stolen from death, occasionally a day. But the outcome remained unchanged. The virus adjusted effortlessly, reshaping itself at a pace that rendered human response obsolete. Where people rushed, it endured. Where panic escalated, it remained indifferent. Time favored the pathogen. It did not surge or overwhelm through chaos. It advanced with restraint. QX17 did not need violence. It relied on inevitability. Human fear accelerated exhaustion, fractured judgment, and eroded cooperation, while the virus required nothing more than biological consistency. It allowed medicine to interfere briefly, then resumed its course as if uninterrupted. Desperation settled into daily existence. Survivors woke with the knowledge that safety was temporary and borrowed. Research teams pressed forward without illusion, driven by obligation rather than belief. Breakthroughs were announced, tested, and quietly abandoned when results failed to repeat. Each disappointment carved deeper fatigue into those tasked with saving lives, yet they continued, aware that surrender meant silence, and silence meant extinction. Outside laboratories, hope decayed unevenly. Some clung to rumors of progress, others rejected updates entirely, unable to absorb further loss. The passage of time no longer suggested recovery. It implied attrition. People measured survival in intervals, not futures. Plans shortened, aspirations narrowed. Existence became reactive, governed by avoidance rather than ambition. QX17 did not announce itself when it claimed another life. It did not escalate when resistance weakened. It simply remained persistent and precise, embedded within the systems meant to protect humanity. The virus had learned nothing new. It did not need to. It had found equilibrium. And within that balance, humans steadily disappeared. And while researchers continued to work, hands shaking from exhaustion and minds dulled by repetition of failure, the virus did what it had always done best. It waited. Silent, unchallenged, certain. The world had shifted into a state of fragile, haunted endurance. Cities, once throbbing with life, were now hollowed shells. Streets were silent except for the occasional sound of a lone survivor moving cautiously through debris-strewn avenues. Factories, offices, and commercial centers remained closed indefinitely. Electricity grids sputtered in places where operators had succumbed. Water treatment, transport, and supply chains faltered. Global commerce ceased as entire nations struggled to maintain minimal functionality. Hospitals had long ceased to operate normally. Entire wards, once filled with patients and caregivers, now stood abandoned or littered with the bodies of those who could not be saved. Doctors and nurses, fewer than a fraction of those who had started, worked in exhausted, haunted silence. Supplies were gone, oxygen tanks were empty, and medications were limited to what little could be salvaged or manufactured under constant duress. Even the privileged, shielded, and fortified compounds with special Medicare discovered that 𝙎𝙤𝙪'𝙧𝙚's patient precision could bypass barriers. Advanced treatments extended life but did not prevent infection. Fear dominated every waking moment. Panic attacks, hallucinations, insomnia, depression, and paranoia were ubiquitous. Survivors described waking in the night, convinced they felt the virus moving through walls, lingering in the air, or watching from a shadowed corner. Families were torn apart, friends vanished without warning, and communities became fragmented. Trust became dangerous. Strangers were avoided at all costs. Humanity adapted not with hope, but with careful calculation, each step measured against the potential for sudden, fatal exposure. Economies had collapsed entirely. Factories, offices, and farms were abandoned. International trade, supply chains, and transportation were crippled. Scarcity defined daily life. Water, food, and medicine became precious commodities, hoarded where possible. In many regions, infrastructure failed entirely. Streetlights went dark, communications networks collapsed, and even emergency services were non-functional. Civilization, built on interdependence, revealed its fragility under a pathogen that needed nothing but patience. Globally, scientists continued their desperate search for answers. Every laboratory had become a battlefield between hope and futility. After months of relentless research, failure, and exhaustion, a partial solution emerged. Medication capable of slowing the progression of 𝙎𝙤𝙪'𝙧𝙚 and mitigating the most immediate fatal effects. This medicine did not cure, it did not immunize, it merely extended life for those who could access it. The wealthy secured supplies first, protected behind fortified walls and special Medicare systems, while the majority relied on dwindling stockpiles, risking contamination or exposure in the process. Survival became an intricate calculation. Every movement, every interaction, every decision carried mortal consequence. Communities that once thrived on collaboration now functioned in isolation, communicating through limited channels or across great distances. Daily life was governed by timing, proximity, and the relentless patience of a virus that observed humanity's routines and exploited weakness with surgical precision. The psychological toll was devastating. Survivors reported vivid nightmares, constant anxiety, paranoia, and disorientation. Children grew up under a shadow of fear, their perceptions of safety forever altered. Adults aged rapidly under stress and grief. Mental illness became endemic, a companion to the virus that could not be treated, only managed. Humanity adapted to the presence of 𝙎𝙤𝙪'𝙧𝙚, but adaptation was survival, not life. Even the wealthy were not exempt from dread. Special Medicare delayed symptoms and provided immediate intervention, yet the virus remained patient and cunning. Every breach in protocol, a delivery, a visitor, or a minor oversight carried the risk of fatal infection. Temporary safety existed only as a fragile illusion, a postponement of inevitable confrontation with 𝙎𝙤𝙪'𝙧𝙚. Humanity had learned to endure under the virus's omnipresent dominion. Habits were rewritten, isolation became ritual, exposure meticulously avoided, and interaction measured to the smallest detail. Life was reduced to survival by calculation. Communities functioned as fragmented units of caution and necessity rather than cooperation. Social bonds existed only when risk could be minimized, and even then, vigilance never wavered. QX17 had become more than a virus. It had become a patient, eternal arbiter of existence. The living clung to every hour, every rationed medicine, every fragile precaution. Civilization had adapted to survive in fragments, but the world would never be the same. Humanity learned that endurance, not conquest, was the only path forward. And through it all, QX17 waited, silent, patient, eternal, watching every movement, measuring every precaution, and ensuring that the virus's dominion remained unbroken. Humanity had survived, but survival was hollow, shadowed by the patient certainty of death that now ruled the earth.